start. Actually, I'm going to record this on, there we go. Okay, now we're recording on both Zoom and YouTube. Okay, well, welcome everybody to today's webinar. My name is Joel Varty. I'm president at Agility CMS, and I'm really pleased today to have our first of the Agility Days webinars where we've actually got some panelists from outside the organization to come in and to fill us with their knowledge. And so today's webinar is called The Fastest Website. So this is our first of the developer track of the Agility Days webinars. So the, how to squeeze the best performance out of your website. And we've got some really great sort of conversation that's going to be coming today. So this webinar is also being streamed on YouTube. And what I'll do is I'll put that out on Twitter, on my own Twitter at Joel Varty, but it'll be available on the agilitycms.com website as well. Most important slide today, we're all in this together. This is a chance for us to learn about each other, for us to learn about you, and for you to learn about us as well. So please do ask questions. We'll be monitoring the Q&A. You can do the put up your hand thing and all that sort of stuff. And I'll be keeping an eye on that today while James and the other folks are sort of chatting and stuff like that. So please feel free to interrupt. And if you're watching this on YouTube, drop stuff in the comments and we'll try to answer those questions there. So yeah, as I said before, my name is Joel Varty, president at Agility. And I'd like to introduce my good friend, James Vidler, our VP of product here. And he's a pretty dynamic guy. He's really happy right now because he just got a dog. And he's been doing a lot of running, and he's been doing a lot of cleaning up after the dog, and he's having super fun with that. But he also, runs our product division and looks after the product vision and the roadmap, but also spends a lot of time just thinking in general about the web and also about VR. So he has a VR game out there that you can go and buy, and I know it's available on the Oculus Go, and I know I've played it. It's pretty fun, and so I'm going to give you called Dodge Block. So go get that. If you want to go spend some time on VR land, we got more time to play video games these days. But now I'm going to turn it over to James.
All right, thanks, Joel. I appreciate that warm introduction there. And yeah, you're right. I am very happy right now. I'm especially happy because dog parks are now open in Toronto.
That's true.
Which means my dog is also a lot happier. So the last couple of days I've been able to take her out, and she's been able to she just runs around circles just like for like 15 minutes. It's great. All right. So wanted to take a moment to introduce our very special guest here. So we have Henri, and Henri, I actually realized I don't know your real last name. Or do you just always go by Henri Helvetica? You just keep that last name sort of secret now. Is that kind of what you do?
Long story short, it was just a Twitter handle, come non plume, and then I just decided to ask conference organizers to use it, and it just started to work. And it makes for a great intro because a lot of people do think it's my last name, and it's totally not, because it's the internet. Nothing's real. But yeah, I mean, it works. So
yeah.
I'll look for that.
And so Henri is a freelance developer and is very involved in the community here in Toronto and really, North America and the world. He's currently the organizer of the 2 Toronto meetups, actually, the Web Performance Meetup, which is very appropriate for today's conversation, but also the JAMstack Toronto Meetup. And it was we actually had a virtual meetup the other week. So JAMstack Toronto's first virtual meetup, which I thought went really well. And we had a couple great guest speakers there, including the CEO of Vercel, Guillermo, I can't pronounce his name now. Guillermo Ranch. Is that how you pronounce it?
Ranch, something like that.
Ranch,
yeah,
yes.
it's fine. I'm sure.
Anyways.
Appreciate that.
Yeah, so Henri is really going to be our web performance pro today, who's going to sort of help walk us through a few things, and hopefully, we can all learn a thing or two from him, myself included. And then last but not least, we have Reeshni Asolan. She actually has an interesting background. She comes from the healthcare industry and recently realized how inefficient a lot of things were in that industry, and she wanted to help really bring their technology to the forefront there. So she's shifted a little bit. You graduated from BrainStation in 2019, and now you're employed as a UX designer and doing some great work over there. So we're very pleased to have you here and really have another perspective here when we're talking about web performance, is that it's not just something that developers need to worry about or think about. It's also something that UX designers really need to pay attention to. So great to have your opinions here. And another little known fact about Reeshni, she's a bit of a whiz when it comes to Harry Potter quizzes and yeah, no pun intended there. But I heard you're a huge Harry Potter fan. So
I am a huge Harry Potter fan.
Oh my God, me too. Yay.
Oh my God. Okay, great. We'll chat about this later.
Awesome.
I'm so excited now.
All right. So yeah, why are we all here? Why do we call this webinar? So really the point of this is we really want to learn what we can do, what we can all do collectively to help promote a faster web. And I think that's something we can really all get around. And so how are we going to do that today? Well, we are actually going to do a live performance audit where we're going to take a website and actually run through it and try to see what we can come up with in terms of how they can increase the performance of their website. So we'll look at things from a UX perspective, but also we'll dive into some technical details. We're going to go through we're going to do an audit. We're going to look at web developer tools. It's going to be fun. So we're going to go to the internet and we're going to find a site. And appropriately, I thought ironically, actually, is that we're doing this on Zoom on a webinar. Why don't we look at the actual Zoom homepage? Actually, we can look at a couple pages, but primarily the homepage is, I think, where let's spend a bit of time on. Mm-hmm. Should be fun, but I will also preface this by saying we are a very happy Zoom customer. So let's try not to talk too bad about Zoom here. And maybe what we can do is at the end of this, we can actually come up with a list of recommendations. And I'd love to actually tweet that to them and say, hey, we found these things you guys can do. Maybe you should take a look. So, we can help them out. They've been helping a ton of companies work remotely. So time to pay it back.
Absolutely.
All right.
I mean, I'm sure it's a company that just in the last 3 or 4 months has seen like a massive surge in traffic. So, there are a lot of things I'm sure they've had to take into consideration that they probably never considered prior to this very interesting moment in history, right? So,
yeah, you certainly can't put any blame in this situation. I don't think they ever foresaw this kind of growth, and but there are certainly some room for improvements here. So first of all, before we sort of dive into some of the performance things here, Reeshni, I wanted to get your take just sort of on the immediate homepage here. Like, what are some of your sort of first impressions that you get when you're looking at this page? Anything you want to comment on there?
Yeah, I mean, the carousel up top as a kind of like having that as like your hero area, not the best. It's definitely, I think there's some issues around accessibility here. And I think as users, sometimes it's a lot of information to take in, especially with the timed carousel that they have. It's kind of, like I was trying to read through some of the slides, and it's a lot to take in, and then it kind of quickly switches you out. So it's a little bit overwhelming as a user, and you might kind of skip that over and kind of look further down the page. And it's unfortunate because it hits a lot of points on their website that is informative for somebody new that's coming to the site who doesn't have a Zoom account, who's maybe interested in more of like a paid subscription plan. So yeah, the carousel is not.
That's a good point. And also it leads me to think, well, did they load all of that stuff at the first render time? So it's like, it also, while it's not a great UX, maybe they downloaded a whole bunch of like images and HTML that we didn't actually need.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely a great point. And, I'll actually jump back to the start to what Reeshni said about accessibility. That's always going to be a very important topic. Accessibility, just like performance, in fact, all fall under sort of like this UX umbrella. So, I mean, my immediate, the minute you mentioned accessibility, and this is something I kind of look for as well. I mean, their gray bar with the white text. I will bet Joel's apartment that is not contrast.
Coming to you from Dwell magazine.
Exactly. So I'll guarantee that's not contrast compliant.
No.
I mean, for a number of reasons, the white on gray, and then we have some transparency right there. And usually transparent backgrounds with text also tend to cause some UX issues. So I've put on a little bit of a UX hat right there.
Yeah.
I mean, what Joel mentioned as well about well, a combination of what Joel mentioned and what Reeshni said as well, in terms of like the carousel. Carousels have never been a sort of a favorite, even though they tend to feel like, you know, you can kind of provide a bunch of information. Now, again, I think there is a tendency to not favor carousels, but if you're going to do it, there's certainly going to be some ways to get it as best as possible. Now, looking at it right away, and like this is where Joel mentioned, maybe loading up a bunch of resources that you don't need, because part of the challenge with performance is the following, you know, you want to be as efficient as possible. So in this case, where again, you mentioned we have probably like a 4 or 5 image carousel, I'm not sure, I can't really tell, but for the best user experience, you're ideally going to load all 4 or 5 at once, because you want to make sure that that next prompt is done properly. You know, if the user clicks on it, he or she wants to make sure that the image comes in. Now, and again, I'm thinking out loud here, so you'll have to pardon me. The one thing I will say that might work in their favor is the fact that some of these images look like they could be SVGs, or at the very least, they could be pings with ping 8 with few colors. So there's a good chance that this could be done well and loaded properly and loaded without the tax of heavy megabytes. So the only one that might be tough might be this one image right here. But seeing that that's like the original image that gets loaded, there's a good chance that that could have come in at a fairly light load. But certainly the subsequent images, if these are SVGs, which we don't know, they may have come in very lightly. So that's where the carousel, as much as we don't like it, may have, you know, not really been much of an impeding resource.
And I would say, yeah, even if they were SVGs, those would have to be some pretty complex SVGs. So even if something is an SVG, I know from personal experience that if it's a complex SVG, sometimes a PNG actually might even be lower file size. So yeah, it kind of depends on some of that stuff.
So that's actually a great point. Yeah. And what I'll say about that is the following. That's why we do the testing. That's why we have to experiment. By default, you know, and we were having this conversation earlier prior to the webinar, you know, performance auditing, there's, I don't want to say there's a level of boredom involved, but it's kind of like, okay, we're at the crime scene. What's going on here? Oh, there's a bullet casing over there. Let's go see what happened there. Oh, there's like a sheet of paper here with bubble gum. Okay, could that be the criminal's bubble gum? I don't know. So you're constantly looking for clues. Now, you mentioned that the SVGs could be complex. They can be. There's a lot of junk in SVGs that we have to remove quite often, which is why there was a tool called oh my God, SVGO, I believe, where you would be able to optimize SVGs. Now, there are several ways of optimizing them. I don't want to get into the entrails, but you can reduce an SVG's complexity for one, and by reducing the amount of layers and / colors as well, you can start to also lessen the complexity of an SVG. And do not forget, the SVG is actual text. So you'll be able to compress it very well. And especially now if you're on Netlify, because they adopted Broadly. So what's going to happen is that you're actually going to get an SVG that might originally start at like, I don't know, 100, 200 kilobytes. It could very much come down to like 10, because you'll reduce the complexity and you'll actually send a lot less down the wire because you will be able to compress it through Broadly or gzip.
Just took a look. These are JPEGs. Okay. And they're actually big JPEGs that have backgrounds in them too. That's awesome.
Okay. I mean, you know, the conversation about what the best image is for to use, that's a separate one we can have maybe a little later, but I just want to sort of like outline what the possibilities are.
For sure.
Yeah, and in terms of some of the other elements that we sort of have on this page here, so we've got that sort of image slider at the top, and then there's this sort of you know, call to actions with simple icons. So like I would think this, you know, there should really be no concern in terms of, you know, how performant something like this is.
Yeah,
I think so, right? Reeshni, do you have any comments on you know, how this sort of looks? I feel like this looks kind of overwhelming to me, lots of different links and things.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of aesthetic issues, I think, with this homepage. At least there's not a lot of, there's very minimal hierarchy. I think like the text is very small, and there's just a lot going on here.
I would say the video webinar and conference rooms icons too are a little
they don't really have, they're not very relevant to kind of what more the description is of it. It's like confusing. I'm like, why? It looks like an alien symbol sort of, but
yeah, and then they got this sort of trust section down here, which is obviously great. You want to have something like this on your homepage. Make sure people know that you're people trust you, people use you.
Yeah, the social proof is good. But...
And then look down here, we have a secondary slider.
I know we do.
So two sliders on the same page. That I think is usually a no-no, but I could be wrong.
I mean, again, I never want to say anything's an absolute no-no. It's how do you manage it properly? You know, how do you do it with your users in mind? How do you do it with resource loading in mind? And, you know, the best way possible, because, you know, maybe it's mandatory. Maybe, you know, the C-suite is like, listen, if this doesn't happen, that's your job. And you're like, okay, so how am I going to load this secondary carousel? Now, the good part here, and there's always good news. So the good part is that since it's below the fold, you will be able to afford yourself some time to load that up, you know? So that being said, you don't have to bombard the user right away with a bunch of resources to look at that they've not even gone down to the page for. I mean, so that's one of the elements that we have to keep in mind at all times. It's like, okay, do I send you all these resources? Because, okay, there's some stats out there. There was one in particular some time back where I believe that at least 2/3 of the page, of the average page, is below the fold. And there was also a stat at some point indicated that 50% of users would make it to the bottom of the page. So there's a good chance that there were a lot of resources loading that the users were never going to see.
Yeah, never even
so
saw
which is
it.
why at the time, I'm sure the developers in you would remember, there was a lot of conversation around intersection observer, because at that time, there was nothing native. Lazy loading wasn't native in the browser yet. The API was being discussed, but it hadn't happened yet. So when intersection observer came around, a lot of people were like, hey, you know, I'm going to use this for images and a bunch of other things like iframes and stuff like that. So by making sure that you're only loading resources that users were in the proximity of, you could be a sort of like disciplined developer in how you handle the resources. So maybe they're doing that, maybe they're not, but again, there'd be ways of handling that secondary carousel as best as possible.
And the other thing I'll notice here is that they have these icons that are sort of switching back and forth. I actually kind of don't mind that, but again, there's just a lot of interactivity on this page, I feel.
I mean, any words?
Animations.
I mean, I was gonna also comment, like having like in the section above, you have like the text over top of like the carousel images here, where it's like the little, like the videos that you can play off. There are definitely better layouts. I understand what they're trying to do. They're trying to bring in more of that social proof and have that kind of validation that, like, you know, we have great recommendations. We work with really great organizations. but I think it's just a little bit poorly executed because it kind of just feels like again and again and again I'm seeing the same thing, which is unnecessary to have on like a page that maybe your users aren't going to be kind of scrolling through fully when they see all of it. It could be, yeah, it just seems a little bit repetitive. And I think there's CTAs, like the CTAs, like it should be, normally you have like your primary one first, like your buy now maybe should be first rather than your request demo first, but like a minor thing, but.
Yeah, it's interesting. They have a lot of competing call to actions because you have to sort of sign up for free in the top right corner. You have request a demo, and you have buy now.
Yeah,
yeah, when you get down here, it sounds like the only option is to buy it.
It's buying, like, it's not a very clear CTA because I don't think you're not necessarily buying anything. You're more like signing up for like a plan. So yeah.
All right. So now that we've sort of gone through here and made some sort, we have made some sort of observations and assumptions sort of based on the page. Let's see how it actually stacks up in the PageSpeed Insights. I shared my screen a little too early on this, so I kind of gave it away. But the results are not too great. It's 11 out of 100 on mobile. But we're looking at the site on desktop right now. So let's just switch over to desktop a little bit, just so we're comparing apples to apples. They're getting 61 out of 100, which it's not atrocious, but it's not great either. The mobile one is kind of the one I'm a little more concerned about, and it's probably because they're not doing as much. They certainly don't have a mobile first design, it feels.
So, I mean, I could look at it on mobile, but I'll do that afterwards. A couple of things I'd like to say. I'm actually going to respond to, I think, a couple of messages in the chat here. Someone had said that the initial load was about 9 megs with 141 requests. So right away, so whoever posted that, thank you very much. And I think it's very important to mention. So in my auditing sort of workflow, when I go into DevTools, that's pretty much the first thing I look at. The number of requests and how heavy the page is, because that will inform you on what likely is taking place. Obviously, the mantra and the sort of like modus operandi is, the quickest request is the one that's never made. So at 141 requests, there's a good chance that some aren't immediately needed at the initial load. Now, at 9 megs, something you'll have to always remember, and this is pretty much gospel. The heaviest resource is almost always going to be an image. Now with the advent, obviously for someone like Zoom who deals in video, if you have a lot of video on your page, that is actually going to take the cake. But for the most part, it's always going to be images. So at 9 megs, there's a good chance that you probably have a number of images up there, and quite possibly they're poorly sized. And someone actually mentioned that as well. I'm not sure who, but that was in there in the comments. And someone had mentioned that, okay, they're pretty big JPEGs, and someone said they'd opt out for transparent PNGs. The one thing I'll say about PNGs is, as great as they are, if you manage them properly, do not forget that PNGs are always going to be a heavy resource quite often. Why? Because it's a lossless format, all right? So it's the one of the two formats that are always going to be heaviest in the images category. The other one being the GIF or the GIF. Do not crucify me. So that being said, I would always say, like, there's a good chance that images are poorly sized, and that's one of the biggest low-hanging fruits of performance. Now, with regards to the score, I'm here to reveal a couple gems. The median score across the web, drum roll please, is 41.
Oh.
So it's actually a failing grade. So on the desktop, we'll say Zoom is passing. On the mobile, they're not. And that could be for a number of reasons. I don't know if you want to go back to the mobile score and we could take a quick look. So what's going on here? First contentful paint. Go down the page for a second. Defer off. Okay, so can you actually click on that defer off-screen images? Okay, so this is actually a really interesting part. So remember what I said about sort of lazy loading and how I mentioned at the time there wasn't any, so people were using intersection observer to sort of lazy load, like fake lazy load. This is essentially what this sort of recommendation is. They're saying like lazy load these images because they could be below the fold. They likely are below the fold, and we want to make sure that they only load when the users is in proximity of the container. So they're telling you that you'll be able to save by doing that, and it'll probably improve your score, pardon me, and more specifically, improve the user experience. And that's a lot of what they have in mind when they mention that. So you'll see it says consider lazy loading off screen or hidden images after all critical resources have finished loading to lower the time to interactive.
And it seems like a lot of these images here, actually, these top ones, these big ones here, are actually part of that second slider that's on that page. That, like you said, doesn't even is even below the fold. Plus, it's in a slider, so you may not even see. Even if you scroll down the page, you still might not even see those other things that are still being loaded in the background.
Absolutely, absolutely, and that's the point. So, and if you look at it quickly, you can see the top two images right there are almost 900 kilobytes combined. So that's literally 1 meg. Off the top, just 2 images, 1 meg. So again, it's the idea of being as disciplined as possible. It's not, we're not here sort of like bashing the design or just like saying how poorly they've managed resources. It's just really about being as disciplined as can be. Yeah. What else here?
So yeah, we looked at deferring off-screen images, serve images in next-gen formats. I see this one a lot. It comes up in pretty much every test you do now, and it's telling people to use these JPEG 2000, JPEG XR, and WebP. To be honest, I've never used these formats, at least knowingly. What's the deal with those?
Okay, so essentially what happened is that for the most part, there are 4 predominant formats on the web. Numero uno, the workhorse by far, is the JPEG, which is about 40% of images online. Number 2 will be the PNG. Actually, there's 5 in total. So number 2 will be PNG, and 3 through 5, you'll have the GIF or GIF format. And then you probably have sort of the last few percentage points are being split between the SVG and the WebP format. Now, the JPEG, the GIF, and let me see, the PNG combined are probably like 100 years old in age. The WebP, believe it or not, as a next-gen format, is turned 10 years old last year. So in the last little while, there's been a lot of research about how to improve performance by using next-gen format images and formats, pardon me. And obviously that also comes with improving the codec. Now, what they mentioned here in terms of the JPEG 2000, JPEG XR, for a number of years, the JPEG was they were trying to improve the JPEG with sort of variants. And the JPEG 2000 is a variant that is lossless, but also provides better compression, but is only readable by Safari in WebKit. The JPEG XR is essentially the same sort of like process in terms of like a better variant of the current JPEG, lossless, but is only being read by Microsoft products. So that means IE, that means Edge.
So it sounds like it's complicated to actually do this because you're talking about how some things work well in some browsers and things don't work in other browsers. So, if I'm a stakeholder of a website, whose responsibility is it to, A, should they use this? B, who actually formats these images? Yeah, like what does that look like?
So you could actually do like the sort of you know, the manual work of you know, having these all converted and sort of set up by using like the picture tag and the sort of source set and whatnot. But with, you know, the idea of images having become so complicated, and ultimately media management is so important today because the web is mostly images. If you look at some of your top apps out there, like, what is Instagram? You know, there's like text on Instagram, but no one cares. You know what I'm saying? So ultimately, media management has really become quite important, quite complicated. And this is why some of this work, this heavy, the sort of like the heavy loading of image management is being outsourced to companies who deal with this specifically. They're like, let me take this issue out of your hands, because we haven't even gotten into the idea of like poorly sized images. You know, that's what I like to call like the distant cousin of performance, but just as challenging, because you're often getting desktop size images to mobile layouts, and that will make your mobile score go kaboom. And that's part of the issue. So the media management can be handled yourself. It does take quite a bit of resources to get done, and the code may not be as attractive once you sort of put it all out there. Or you can go to a company that has an API. It's like, just give us the file and we'll take care of the rest. So, you know, not to get into the intros, it's super interesting stuff to look at the 2000, the XR, the WebP, but they are next gen formats that not everyone knows about, but at this point, they may not need to know about it.
Yeah. So Reeshni, I'm curious, you know, as a designer, you know, when you're working with images and you're, you know, putting together mock-ups and that kind of things, and then you're delivering assets to the developers, you know, are you the one actually sort of formatting these for web, or that's usually the responsibility of the developer at that point?
Yeah, I think unfortunately, it's something that we do leave to the developers. I think, and that's wrong. I think we need to take a little bit, and myself, and I think a lot of designers that I've worked with or that I know, we tend to sort of think like, once I've, you know, come up with the design and the UI is all done, just like ship it and you're done. But I think it's really our responsibility as well, since we are trying to deliver this great user experience. We need to take it upon ourselves to kind of, you know, resize those images so they are appropriate for the different breakpoints that they're going to be implemented on, right? And,
yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah, and even just like the website is actually pretty. I was thinking about like fonts as well. That's something that sometimes when you're using very obscure fonts, which sometimes web pages do, Zoom thankfully doesn't. They're just using, I think, a Google font. But that's something to take into consideration. Like if you're using multiple fonts and different weights, different styles, that can have an effect. So I think the designer's mentality sometimes needs to think a little bit about those choices.
Yeah, because really, you know, the end product of the website, you know, really reflects back on, you know, who thought of the idea, right? So it's, yeah, I think maybe I think developers also need to like do a better job of looping back to the designers sometimes. To be like, hey, this thing, you know, is causing some performance issues. Can we work together to try to figure out something, right? And I think that collaboration is really important.
Definitely, yeah.
You know, I couldn't say it any better, because I've always realized that you know, the designer and developer collaboration seems at times as you know, complicated as like the sort of like, you know, CSS versus JS conversation. And it shouldn't be. And I think that, you know, I've given presentations at sort of like design conferences or for like design-minded audiences. And the one thing I always mention is that, you know, by having sort of a collaborative sort of environment where it's not like, oh, the designers are done, we're going to FedEx this sort of like, info to like the developers, and when they get it, they'll just get it done and deploy it, when it should be like all together in the same room. And I'll give you a perfect example why. So if we look at the landing page, and I believe it was the one picture of the gentleman smiling on his couch, whatever, on a Zoom date, I guess. And then the rest were like these illustrations and whatnot. Now, if I had a designer in the room and, you know, we were sort of like both looking at the mock-up, I might have said something like, well, you know what? I wouldn't mind having the initial image or all the images just illustrations. Mm-hmm. And I would make the argument that we can make these illustrations SVGs or PNGs with some transparency, whatever. But, you know, PNGs would say no more than 16 colors, or maybe even 8. Or like I said, the SVGs. Why? Because the PNG is going to come in small. Why the SVG? Because I'll be able to compress it easily, because the SVG is text, even though it's listed as an image, or comes up as an image. So you start to have these conversations, because I will tell you that as I want to make sure that the initial load is as quick as possible, and I'm doing everything I can. I'm using the best resources available to me for the web to make sure that initial resource load is like cattle prod fast, like pow. And then I run that by the UX person, the designer, and say, what do you think? Can you work within these parameters? You know, because, you know, my CTO says, I have 300 kilobyte budget to load this page. What am I going to do? So I have to share that with my designer and my UX professional and be like, how are we going to get this done? So that collaborative environment is going to be key in having that sort of like myopic look on how to make sure to load this page as fast as possible.
Yeah, and if we're looking at this, you know, page speed report, really they're highlighting the images as like, you know, front and center, like start with the images. And I think that's always usually a good place to start. But it does look like there are also some other things that are highlighted in this audit as well, which is, Reeshni, you mentioned fonts. So, you know, there is something here just saying like, hey, you should make sure the text remains visible so that it doesn't have to wait for the font to load. Serving static assets. So I think this just comes down to their, the assets that they actually are loading in, which includes fonts and images, just don't have any sort of cached TTL. So they're always requested on every page request. They're not cached by the client. Again, more static stuff, but there's also these things here really around like minimizing main thread work and reduce JavaScript execution time. And so it's not always images, right? The JavaScript can also play, you know, it's great for making fast websites sometimes, but it can also, you know, with great power comes great responsibility. And I've seen some pretty nasty sized JavaScript files lately, especially too, as more developers are getting in and starting with, you know, building JavaScript. So I'd like to look and see, like, let's look into like the JavaScript a little bit, or just really the site as a whole, to try to figure out like what are really the big resources here. And I highlighted it earlier, but like we have 5.1 megabyte transfer, 9.7 megabyte resources. And I actually learned this from Henri actually at his talk that he did at the Web Unleashed conference back in October. I didn't know what these meant before. And so when you see this 9.7 megabytes, that's not actually what was transferred and what you actually downloaded. That's the sort of like raw size, but these are all served, I guess these are like compressed, right? These are like gzipped. So this is like the total amount that your browser is processing, but only 5.1 megabytes was actually transferred. Am I correct in that understanding?
So basically what'll happen is that if your transfer and resource size are the same, you're having, you haven't compressed the resources that can be compressed. So basically you're not gzipping, you're not using broadly. And that is actually, again, part of the challenge, is that, you know, you can find these very low hanging fruits that are literally one switch away from changing your resource load. All right. So for example, quite a while back, and I'll probably find it and maybe plug it into the site, the chat, there was an article, I think by Netflix, where they had sort of start to consider performance a lot more, and they're poking around, and they found out that essentially there were a bunch of files that they weren't compressing, gzipping, or using broadly, and that brought their transfer size down significantly. And that might seem like small fries, but quite often enough, this is bandwidth that you have to pay for, whether it's you shipping that out or the user taking that in, because they might be on mobile and they're like, what the hell is going on? And every time they're just getting like these 10 meg loads. And this is, again, small little touch points that if you actually take a look and see what's going on, you can make some immediate changes. And that to me is a low-hanging fruit. And that's what that's all about, So, and it's funny because I was actually going to click on the page thinking that this was my screen, but it's not. But you'll be able to, let me see here, I'm looking at your dev tools, and can I see it? Size, no, it doesn't. You probably have to actually,
what would you like me to do?
So if you right click where it says like that bar where it says domain type and all that stuff. Okay, where is it here? Time, priority, sort by
scheme, protocol, method, URL path.
Go down to response headers. Oh no, go down to sort by. Domain type, initiator size, time, waterfall. I'll go back to response headers. Why is it that I can't find cache control?
What are you looking for?
Cache control. Okay, go to content encoding.
Yeah.
Bingo. Where is it? Is it what I'm looking for?
There it is. There.
Yeah, there it is. Okay. So you can see there's a bunch that are gzipped and not and broadlead. But if you actually go back to where it's actually blank. Okay. So hold on, I got to move something here. You may see some files that should be gzipped or not. Oh, well, in this case, actually, the ones are. So it's actually, that's not the best example. But what would then happen if you filter it like that, you can actually start to see which type of files are not being gzipped or broadlead at all. So right away, you can say, okay, you know what? I'll be able to make some savings if these files here that are not being gzipped or broadlead and are eligible to do so can be set up properly. So again, these are part of the sort of like little processes that you have during an audit where you literally look at files individually to see what's happening with each one.
Well, yeah, I mean, if we're looking at this one here, and this is actually served from CloudFront, and this doesn't have any content encoding on it. And this is one of the big images. This is 515 kilobytes.
So the content encoding will mostly be effective and happen with text files. All right.
Oh, okay. So not so much image files then.
Exactly.
Okay.
But like I said, in this one, the fact that it was like 9 megs in resources and about like 5 in transfer, there's obviously a bunch of resources that are being gzipped or compressed ultimately.
So that's a pretty good sign. So you're like, if you have both of those, not varying too much, then, that really indicates you've got a problem there and you should look at compressing those resources. But it looks like they're doing a pretty decent job of that.
Yeah, exactly. In this case, they are. And, the fact that, there was a very large gap between transferred and the actual resources meant that, yes, some of it is being done for sure.
Yeah. And if we start breaking down these resources, so it's like, if I look at the image tab here, I can see 2.7 megabytes out of that 5.1 megabytes are all images. So, spending a lot of time and trying to optimize those images, you could get some decent potential savings. But that being said, there's still like, 2.4 megabytes here that's unaccounted for. So it's not just images.
Yeah, absolutely. And, there's some things like, again, that, you have to use, you have to have CSS there. You have to have JavaScript there. Are you using these resources liberally? That is where you need to ask questions. And which is why in DevTools, and I believe in Firefox DevTools now too, so Chrome DevTools, Firefox DevTools, you're able to take a look at, oh my God, my parents are FaceTiming me. I'm sorry. Oh, what just happened?
We
sorry.
interrupt this webinar to join in. With
Right, you're still there. You're still there.
Yeah, exactly. So there's this thing called code coverage now, where you're able to look at the amount of resources within a CSS and or JavaScript file, what percentage of that is being used and what isn't. So actually, oh, again, here I'm thinking that I was looking at my desktop. So if you could just bring your window a little further to the right here. Oh, actually, no, don't. I'll just move my thing. So go down to, you see where it says console request blocking?
Yep.
Okay, so no, right click that whole area. No. So the nav bar. So right click right there.
Oh, why is my thing's not?
Okay, so don't worry about that. Actually, click the three little dots. Okay, see where it says coverage? Yeah.
Oh wow, I didn't know this was a thing.
Yeah. So pull that up. All right. So now see where it says just reload. Just do that.
Wow.
Okay.
I had no idea this was in Chrome.
Welcome to the dark side. So so right away you can see from this UI, it'll tell you which resource, the size, the unused bytes, and then you could also tell with the progress bar. Okay. Now you have an idea of how much of it is, I don't want to say necessarily wasteful, but you know that you're potentially working with some resources that are being used in total. Now, why is this important? Because you know that CSS and JavaScript has to be parsed entirely. So you're potentially parsing resources that you're never using in the end. Now, let's have some more fun. Click on the resource itself, double click. Okay, actually double click, oh, boom.
Yeah.
So if you look, everywhere it's blue is what's being used, and where it's red, it's not.
Oh, wow.
So you can start to see the blocks of code that are not being executed.
I'm actually familiar with this file.
Okay.
This is actually a widget from Zendesk. I think it's to like show the little like helper or support icon in the bottom right corner.
Well,
we have the same thing.
All right. You do, huh?
We do, and I've noticed it before. That I'm like, man, this is a like, you know, because it's like 300 kilobytes and it's like a lot of JavaScript.
Yeah. Well, ultimately, what I want to say there is the fact that, again, if we start to look at performance as sort of like disciplined delivery, it's kind of like, okay, where can I make some edits? Because I know that part of this file is never going to be used. You know, can I remove this block? Yes, I can. Okay, cool. Because I want to make sure that what I deliver down the pipe is as efficient as possible. All right.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like, you're in here for a snack. Why am I giving you a 5-course meal? You know, like that's sort of like idea that you want to sort of take away from that.
And now Zoom, you know, Zoom's developers, of course, wouldn't have any control of, you know, changing, you know, the Zendesk embed widgets and things. So there's really not much they can do around that. It's you know, you decide to use it and you kind of just have to deal with the consequences there, right?
But it's interesting, you know, I think that's a good reason potentially for developers to recommend or not recommend certain tools. It could be that's like, hey, I found this great widget for our homepage, and it, you know, someone says, hey, you need to use, you know, brand X's widget for your homepage. And the developer puts it in, it's like, oh, that just took our page speed score to 11. And it's like 2 megabytes of JavaScript, of which we use like 1/10 of it. Maybe we should use that widget.
That's absolutely correct. And it gets back to the idea that, okay, well, I can whip this up real quick and get maybe like an MVP and see how it's going to feel. But then when I go to production, maybe I'll spin up something that's a bit more vanilla, because there's not much of it, of this sort of amazing widget that I need. It's really like this block. So you want to make sure that you can somehow create this edit of this widget that fits within your sort of like performance needs. And I get back to the idea of someone had mentioned about a budget existing. You absolutely need to have sort of like a budget, because if you give yourself a blank check with regards to sort of like using resources on the web right now, we're just not in that space in 2020. You know, people need to download and reach sites as quickly as possible, as efficiently as possible. I think it's the very reason that right now, unfortunately, in this sort of climate that we're at, and you know, we could even say go as far as saying crisis, you're seeing some government sites that are rebuilding and trying to make it as sparse as possible and still deliver all the information they need. I was talking to someone from a department in California who did a long blog post about what they what some of the changes, what are some of the changes they made to their site to make it fast, efficient, accessible. The government gov.uk.extra, I'm not sure what they did, you know, what the URL is, but they recently talked about some of the changes that they made to make sure that the site was accessible as can be, because especially now that everyone is online quite often on their phones to get all the pertinent information that they need right away, you want to make sure that these things are loading as fast as possible. So we're talking about like real life-saving needs right now.
I had a question for Reeshni. So, you know, Henry said a lot of stuff there about like performance and about being accessible. And I just wanted to go back to things like the carousel, because I know when carousel sort of came of age in, you know, the early 2010s, or maybe even earlier than that, the idea is like, we want to get as much information above the fold and we want to get as much information in front of people as possible. And I think maybe that goes in contrast to what Henry was saying, but what do you think about that in terms of like how much information to present to people?
The carousel for that header area, I think it's overwhelming. I think a lot of users tend to skip over something like that, or they don't fully browse through it. So I think it loses its effectiveness somewhat when you have it like that. And I think there have been quite a few studies that have sort of mentioned that a lot of users don't really go through carousels when they are presented, even if that's below the fold. It's just like some of the information just gets lost in there. So they're not as effective as I think a lot of companies and people, designers are hoping it is meant to be. So I have to agree that it's not the best way to present that information. And I don't think it's the most effective way to present that information for the users. I know that they have a lot going on there, and I think it's accessibility wise, I think there's definitely a lot of issues that it wouldn't be compliant. At least like some, maybe AAA, it wouldn't be compliant with some things since it's moving quite quickly. And even like the text over some of the images and things like that. So not the best.
Yeah, and I think I've I can't remember the name of it now, but there's this sort of idea with, when it comes to design, and again, I'm no expert in this, but the idea is like, you want to keep things simple, right? You don't want to give the user too many different options. You don't want to inundate them with too much information. Give them, it's short and sweet and to the point. And I think, you know, editors or marketers are so focused on trying to get more into that sometimes it's like you kind of have to dial them back a little bit. Come with a more focused message, try A/B testing, like that kind of thing, as opposed to just putting all of the information on the page.
Yeah. There's a lot of like cognitive overload when you're looking at this. Like I didn't really understand like where I was supposed, it kind of distracts, I think, the user as well from like what maybe the intention is of like Zoom itself. I think you sometimes, like I got a little lost in there. I was just like staring at the carousel for a little bit, trying to take it in. And then you kind of just like, once you get a little bit overwhelmed as well, maybe you don't want to venture further into the site and see what else they have to offer. So be a little bit aware of that, I think.
No, it definitely, I think the carousel was a, you know, sort of like a great idea in a web long behind us, you know, but it kind of just stuck around because it was a way of just having like stuff, you know, in front of you, and you didn't have to go to the bottom of the page, where I think people are more, I mean, people are savvy now. The web's been around like 30 years, and they know that they could just jot down to the bottom of the page and find the information they need. Something I want to mention real quickly, since I sort of got into the idea of having a web that is light, a web that is efficient, and possibly sparse. And it's certainly in a situation like we are in right now with, quarantine life, as someone mentioned shout outs Vanessa, someone mentioned in the chat. But it is absolutely important because, events, world events like this one, or like meteorological events, they happen, and people need to get the information as quickly as possible. So what do? Well, maybe some of maybe some don't, or are going to find out, but there's some news sites that have had their sort of like emergency versions, or their light versions on the web, and that are still working right now. So if anyone is curious, CNN's got a light version, and if you go to light.cnn.io, and it's basically the current page on CNN.com, but just text, as simple as can be. I've actually been doing a little bit of, sort of like touch and go on this little piece I'm writing, but you're seeing right now where instead of having the two separate sites, some companies are just trying to be as light as possible on their main page. So the idea that we want to make sure that resources that are wasteful aren't loading is not new. It's whether or not you can actually sort of like have an amalgam of both concepts, which is your modern page and the light resources.
I remember, shoot, and I can't remember his name now, but he was a speaker at the Web Unleashed conference back in October, and he had a sort of closing talk of the whole thing. Maybe you'll remember his name, where he gave a talk on sort of like the fidelity of the web, right? Where it's like, you can have all these great features, and there's certain people that can take advantage of those, depending how powerful the client is, how much internet speed they have. You can deliver some amazing experiences on the internet, but you still have all of those other users who might be on much slower internet connections. They may be accessing your website on your phone, on a cellular network. And how do you sort of adapt your website for those kind of users so that, for example, if I have 100 megabyte data cap per month, which some users do, just going to this Zoom web page is going to eat up, 5% of my entire bandwidth for the whole month. So that sort of idea, and he talked about having like sort of like a fidelity slider, where it's like you could load a page, and you just see like a very, very like plain text, like almost like print CSS kind of like experience, but then be able to sort of dial that up if your device can handle it, right?
Yep. And that's something that on the performance side, we've been sort of secretly, well, I shouldn't say secretly, but battling all the time. And how do you what are the APIs you create, and once they're sort of in the browser, are people going to use them? And ultimately there's messaging that's involved, right? So there's so many, there's some great APIs out there that can help out with that. And you can sort of selectively, ultimately, load particular resources depending on the user's conditions. So for example, if you took something like the network information API, which I think conceptually is fantastic. So they could pull your sort of like bandwidth, and you can also pull your connection speeds and whatnot. And then you can set that up so that like, oh, you know what? If they're in these kind of conditions, well, I'm going to send this very light SVG instead of like this detailed image. These are the kind of things that we talk about quite often. But it's not easy, and that's why I give shout outs to the browser engineers all the time, because they're giving us some tooling that is absolutely next level. Someone said recently that the browser is probably the greatest piece of software that's ever been built. I tend to kind of agree. because if you consider the conditions that we are jumping in and out of all the time, we were at Union Station, we were outside, then we went inside Tim Hortons, then we left again. It's like everything is changing every minute. And yet we are still expecting that resource. We're expecting that page to load instantly. So it's a big deal, man. Sorry, I get emotional.
All right, so just looking to sort of wrap up sort of our thoughts here a little bit and summarize. So in terms of, and I just want to sort of highlight, break down where is most of these megabyte transferred, where is this all sort of coming from? Obviously images would be number one. So, if you have something like this, look at encoding your images, optimizing them. Don't load them if you don't have to, especially if they're below the fold. Reconsider your use of carousels if you have to. If we're looking at JavaScript, on this page, you can see this is 2.1 megabytes out of the 5.6 or so. And actually what's funny is if you look at the highest consumers here, it's actually nothing to do with the actual website. The first one that has to do with the website here is this one, which is 74 kilobytes. So it's not bad. The core website here is actually quite fast. So, props to the Zoom developers on that. Unfortunately, they have all this other third-party stuff, which is kind of clogging it up. Again, I don't know what they can do about that, or whether it's a discussion that needs to be had with marketing, or if there's a better way to load those scripts. I don't personally, I know we've struggled with similar issues, on our own website, where it's like we have all these tools that are great for analytics and, help us understand what people are doing on our website, but they add a fairly significant load to that. Already, is there anything that you can recommend in terms of does putting those in Google Tag Manager sort of help load those after the fact? Is there anything there that can be done to really help?
It's funny because Nicole Sullivan from Google yesterday sort of pulled her following and asking about third-party resources, how they're handling it and whatnot. Again, it's the idea that you want to be as disciplined as possible. CTO is dueling with your CMO, and they're like, we need these tags there, and CTO is like, well, these tags are basically like driving with the handbrake on, and you have to create this sort of middle ground, a bit of a compromise, to make sure that ultimately people like Reeshni are like, your user experience is okay here. I don't know what you're doing, but it's working. The collaborative environment is what's going to make it work, and again, once you get into, big enterprise companies, they want to make sure that they get all their analytics and all that. You can't just sort of strike out and say hey, we got to take all these third parties down. How do you manage them as best as possible? That's it. So you have, applications like WebPerfMap that people should take a look at, because one of the challenges in third parties, they actually make fourth party calls, as we like to call. I would like to say, pardon me. So a lot of these third parties end up having these raves in the background, and everything's absolute madness. So it's really about the discipline, and having these conversations and just working with what you need immediately, and then you can figure out about the rest.
It might also help too if if you're a customer of something like Hotjar or Zendesk, is to actually contact them and say, hey, your widget is huge. Is there something you guys can do to make it smaller? You get enough people doing that, and you might be able to get some more results.
Absolutely. So it's communications.
Yeah. And the last thing I want to highlight here is so we got images, JavaScript, but then the last one that's pretty large on them is the fonts. And, Reeshni, I wanted to ask you a question about this, which is we're looking at about 0.5 megabyte in just fonts. When you're designing things, where does the sort of font come into play in terms of when you're designing stuff? Is it something that really is considered, or do you ever look at what fonts are sort of built into most operating systems? What is freely available you don't need to download, or you just always automatically go for a custom one?
So it's kind of hard to say, because that should definitely be more of a UI consideration. But right. From my experience, it really depends on like sometimes what the overall aesthetic is that you're trying to achieve with the design sometimes. So I think unfortunately, I don't think sometimes that is really considered in terms of like where that is going to be pulled, or if you're wanting to use kind of specialized fonts. So I think that's where it really is important for you as a designer to be kind of cognizant of these things, and in terms of, okay, am I going to be using, like, how many different font styles am I using? And
yeah, it seems here I do see that they're loading a couple of fonts from Google, which are fairly small. We're talking like 15 kilobytes. But they have these custom ones. It looks like they have 2 custom ones here for Lato. Which
Lato is where you can find that on Google Fonts. So
interesting.
I don't know what, maybe things have changed, but I think unfortunately sometimes as designers you maybe want to think outside the box and use these custom fonts that aren't going to be able to be cached or open faster. So that might cause a little bit of a concern, but that's why when, Henry was saying, like, you should have that collaborative environment where you are talking to your developers and discussing, hey, this maybe is there a different font we can use that has the same like feel and aesthetic that you're going for, that might be a little bit more accessible. But
yeah, no, I haven't done much design and stuff, but when I have in the past, is that I always reach for like browser defaults, and I just sort of show those to the customers and be like, hey, do you like this? And they'll be like, yeah. And sometimes, and if they go for it, it's like, sweet, I don't have to worry about custom fonts. But sometimes, you don't really have that sometimes fonts are very important, especially if it comes down to branding. Like if you have your own custom font that's associated with your brand, you kind of have to use those.
Yeah, exactly.
But just another consideration to take there. But there's probably something they can do to, I think, decrease their font size.
Yeah.
So to sort of summarize this up, and I just wanted to update this PowerPoint because we'll probably share this out. So number 1 is reduce or optimize images. 2, well, in terms of their JavaScript, a lot of those, I would say, reconsider, third party. I didn't see any sort of issues, to be honest, in terms of their actual, first party JavaScript that they're writing. That seemed to be pretty fine for me. But I bet you they probably have scripts in there that they don't use anymore, because that always happens is people add scripts and then they just forget to remove them. And as Henri had highlighted, you can actually use that code coverage thing to be able to see what's actually being used. So that's pretty cool.
I'd, the optimizing of images is always going to be the lowest hanging fruit. That's, I've often said it's like, such a heavy resource, you're likely going to get the greatest amount of savings there. Now, I also, again, a big believer, there are a lot of just, switches that are that need to be on and should be off, or that need to be off and, whatnot. It's really just one quick switch. And part of it is just really a quick scanning of what's going on the page. So go into DevTools and see what's going on a network load, because quite often enough, you'll be able to spot these bizarre behaviors that are taking place right before your eyes. I've always said that, the browser, again, getting back to the idea, it's such an ingenious piece of software that they can make the most chaotic site look amazing, but in the background, it's like fire and brimstone, and you'll have no idea because it's such a beautiful layout. You're like, this is perfect, but you don't know that it's loading 15 megs.
So you look behind the scenes.
Exactly. And next thing you know, you're getting a bill from Rogers talking about you've capped out on data. So it's about, popping the hood open, seeing what's going on. You'll find sometimes that resources are being called twice. You have no idea why. This is why we have to do these kind of audits. You'll find out that people are loading desktop resources for mobile, thinking that all they had to do is do like a display none, and realizing that that's not how it works. It's really about just, taking your time and looking at the sort of network waterfall, whether it be into DevTools or going into web page test, and saying like, hey, what's going on here? I have like a 900 kilobyte SVG, and it's only 2 colors, black and transparent. There's something wrong here. So this is the kind of like auditing that you need to do to really be as disciplined as possible, because quite often enough, it just won't happen like hocus pocus, right?
Yeah. So I think this is probably a pretty good place to sort of leave off here. Unless there are any other points that you guys wanted to add, or any of our participants wanted to add.
Joel, you've been quiet there. What's going on?
I've just been enjoying it. I've been going on. I've been typing in some comments. I've been on the live stream on YouTube and dropping. So Henry, when you've been putting links on there, I've been actually taking those and putting them over the live chat. We've had a bunch of people on the live stream, awesome. So that's great. Yeah, so this has just been really great to have you guys join us as panelists and to learn so many. There's like, we could talk for days about web performance, and seems to be new things that we learn all the time. And that's what's really great is, when you can show a guy like James, who's been around Chrome DevTools forever, and then like there's this code coverage thing, and literally, I literally saw his head explode.
Mind blown. I'm going to go run that on a few sites right after this.
Totally.
For sure.
Yeah. So there's just so much there. And then how that works hand in hand with user experience. Thank you so much for Reeshni for sort of keeping us in perspective about that and showing us a different perspective from that, because it is really important. And I think, the more that we work together as teams, both within and without and outside the organizations that we're comfortable with, there's just so much we can learn from each other, and just to make a better web. So
yeah, I feel like the days of sort of developers and designers working in silos, I think that really needs to end, and promote a lot more collaboration.
Absolutely.
You bet.
It's it should be a kumbaya thing.
For sure. Absolutely. Well, this has been great. To keep up with the rest of our webinars that are coming up, so we have every 2 weeks we have different Agility Days webinars coming up. So the next one is in 2 weeks from now. So check out agilitycms.com/events to see the next one, which will be posted very shortly. Follow us on Twitter at AgilityCMS. And if you want to reach out to us to talk to us about whatever, just get in touch at sales@agilitycms.com, and we'll be happy to talk to you guys and sort of continue the conversation. Again, thanks to Reeshni and Henri, and thanks James for leading this thing and sort of bringing this content along.
Yeah, and if you guys want to learn more and talk with Henri and Reeshni, add them on Twitter and follow them.
Yay! Thank you very much for organizing this agility. This was a lot of fun, and I'd sort of looked forward to the sort of free-flowing conversation. So I hope everyone took a little something from it. And yes, please be free to give me a ping, and Reeshni, man, we should get together and talk like, sort of like above the fold and, images, so that, you can go back in there and talk to your developers. Like, I don't know about this.
I know. I love this. Like, it wasn't, to be honest, I remember when James told me about this, I was like, oh, okay. I was like, I don't know how much insight I can add to this or what it is, but I was like, I'm just going to do this so I can like learn from everybody. So I think this is so important, like, especially for us designers also, to be cognizant of these things when we're working in these environments, if you're not able to have that free flowing collaboration, so that you're just more aware. And like, it's so great to kind of learn a little bit as well of like the tools that developers are using. So I love this. This was a really great experience and a really great talk. So I learned a lot.
Awesome. Well, I'm glad you guys enjoyed it. And thank you again to everyone who attended on Zoom and have been watching on our live stream. I think that YouTube link will be converted to like an actual video. So it's, if you want to watch a recorded version of that, you can watch it on there.
Awesome.
Okay. All right. Take care, everybody, and have a great Thursday.
Thanks again, everyone.
Bye.
All right.
Enjoy.